Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this session, which is held as part of the Forum on Internet Freedom in Africa. My name is Koliwe Majama. I'm your moderator for this session, which is organized by a coalition known as the African Declaration on Internet Rights and Freedoms. And this afternoon, we will be looking at the status of digital rights in Africa. And this is just a reflection of the 2 years that we have been undergoing as we face the COVID-19 pandemic globally. And for us in particular, as the coalition, our interest is largely looking at the status of rights that we looked at in the compilation of a paper that we compiled on our position on the status of digital rights in 2020. Just before we start the session, I would like to welcome the participants and also just a quick reminder that as we engage today, we're going to be guided by the Fifth Africa Code of Conduct, which you can find on the event website, which is www.internetfreedom.africa. And also as we engage, we would really appreciate that you share some of your, opinions, observations, and also some of the interesting highlights in the conversation that we're going to have, which our panelists are going to share using the hashtag #FifthAfrica21 and also Internet Freedom Africa. Please feel free to tag us, the AFDEC Coalition, at Africa Net Rights. So I thought that to begin the session, I would just introduce the coalition itself. The coalition is convened, or rather coordinated, by a secretariat, which includes the Association for Progressive Communications, who I worked for as a link and coordinator of the coalition. The other members are the Media Rights Agenda, based in Nigeria, and the Media Foundation for West Africa, who are based in Ghana. So in terms of this session, and just linking or just hinging the conversations that we're going to have today, I thought that it was important for you to understand that primarily the work of the coalition is to look at or contribute to national or regional internet-related policy frameworks so that they can respect human rights, but they are also particularly guided by what we call the African Declaration, which is looking at 13 principles, 4 of which we're going to, speak to in the conversation today. But there's a lot of work also that goes around, just increasing the capacity of civil society actors, human rights defenders, and media rights activists to engage and to also collaborate on the various advocacy or awareness activities in their, constituencies, so that they can speak well or better around digital rights issues. And a lot of collaboration goes after we have that sort of increase in the capacity. But largely, and also in particular for this session, is our response to digital rights violations, and also looking at what actions can be implemented towards making the internet regulation or policy frameworks in the continent respect human rights online. So without trying to steal the show today, I'll just say briefly that the session today is going to assess and evaluate the status of 4 online right freedoms that are also highlighted in the African Declaration. And these were identified by the coalition members in 2020. They went through a process to engage on the selected rights, which include access to information and affordability, privacy, surveillance, and personal data protection, the right to information, and gender equalities and marginal communities. And I think this is broadly looking at the fact that we want to stop looking at marginal communities only being in respect of gender equality, but also looking at the differently abled communities that we live with in society, because the reality is, as Africa gets more digital, there are realities, or rather inequalities, in the levels of access. So to launch the session, we are going to have our first speaker, and the way we're going to have the session is she will make her presentation, which will be a 5 to 7 minute, maximum 10 minutes lightning talk that will be focused on access and affordability. And this presentation will be given to us by Nompilo Simanje, who is the Legal and ICT Policy Officer for the Media Institute of Southern Africa's Zimbabwe chapter. So Nompilo's work broadly relates to monitoring of law, policy changes, as they relate to access to information, media freedom, freedom of expression, and the right to privacy. She also does quite a lot of work around strategic litigation on behalf of the organization and some of the stakeholders that they interact with. Nompilo, I'm handing over to you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Koliwe. I have a presentation, but I'm not going to use it at this time. But should any of our participants request the presentation, I will send it over to you. And thank you very much to APC for organizing this, and to CPESA as well for convening this conference. I'm really excited to be joining you and to speaking on issues relating to internet access and affordability, particularly the key trends in the region from the time when APC produced its position paper and the developments that we have noted to date. And I really appreciate, I think some of the key issues that we would want to talk about firstly would be speaking to the principle itself in terms of the African Declaration on Internet Rights and Freedoms. So I think what we need to remember as we have this conversation is that the principle is principle 2 of the declaration, and it highlights the need for access to the internet, availability and affordability of the internet to all persons without discrimination on any grounds. And also that, access to the internet should not be restricted either through way of shutting down or through way of blocking, and that any such conduct obviously would constitute to a direct interference with the right. But what I also want us to appreciate is the importance of internet access, particularly during the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm sure many of us would have hoped that by now we would have done away with the pandemic, but since 2020 to date, it's 2 years now into the pandemic, and some critical issues that are coming out include the heavy reliance on the internet, or the importance of internet access for purposes of work, for purposes of access to information, and also for purposes of education. So in Zimbabwe and also several other countries like South Africa, there's been introduction of e-learning, that's digitization of the education sector. Also, the media industry has also embraced ICTs and the different platforms to communicate and disseminate news. We have also seen online movements during this time, and of course, issues relating to e-commerce and electronic transactions. But in terms of the trends now that we have noted, one key issue I'd want to highlight is the widening of the digital gap. I'll give examples from countries like Zimbabwe, Lesotho, and Malawi, because as Mr. Zimbabwe, we have been doing a digital rights literacy campaign in some of these countries and 3 other countries in the region. So these are some of the issues that we're coming out. And firstly, I think one issue which still remains quite a challenge is the economic divide. And what we notice is that internet access seems to be a luxury, especially for individuals with low income levels. And now also because of the COVID-19 regulations and their impact on the informal sectors, we have seen also how that has affected internet access for ordinary citizens in some countries in the region, or in most countries in the region rather. Issues of cost of devices, particularly smartphones and laptops, remains an issue, and also high cost of mobile data also remains an issue. And what we note is that for many internet users, what they are doing is that they would purchase data specifically for one platform or 2 platforms. So someone would have data only for WhatsApp or only for Facebook, as compared to having mobile data to access all platforms, including overall the internet. And then in terms of rural and marginalized communities, the issue of lack of infrastructure still continues, and even more so for basic mobile network without necessarily talking about the internet. Issues of electricity, particularly in rural communities in Malawi as well and in Zimbabwe. And also we've noted that mobile network operators are not maintaining base stations, and also that is contributing to poor quality of service. And of course, for the rural and marginalized communities, that includes limited access to information and e-learning platforms. But also these rural communities are also affected due to lack of digital literacy skills and also language barriers. I'll give an example of Zimbabwe, where we have 16 official languages, but you'd note that in most of our platforms, we're communicating in English, and also that seems to widen the digital divide and the gap, particularly for rural communities in their access and use of the internet. And then for women, the issues of cyberbullying and harassment still continue, but also they're entrenched gender inequalities around access to financial resources, which also subsequently are contributing to the widening of the gender divide and restricting women's access to the internet and women's use of the internet. Another issue also was the Inclusive Internet Index for 2021, which showed that several countries in the region are still ranking lowest, and particularly some countries also have actually gone even much lower than the last ranking in 2021. And I'll give examples of countries like Tanzania, which was rated 98 out of 120, Malawi rated 114 out of 120. And this index looks at issues like availability of the internet itself, affordability, issues of relevance of content, among others. So these are some of the issues also that are coming out that several countries in the region still rank lowest when we look at some of these indexes. And then also one critical issue was issues of internet shutdowns. We have seen a common trend, particularly during elections and protests. And I'll give examples to some of the countries in the region. In January 2021, in Uganda, there were presidential elections, and there was also blocking of access to Facebook. And then in Ethiopia, the shutdowns started in 2020, November 2020, but they continued into 2021 due to some protests that were happening in one of the regions. And then when we look at Congo, in March 2021, they also had presidential elections, and also there was an internet shutdown. June 2021, Nigeria had its presidential elections, and also there was blocking of Twitter. So we are seeing a trend also of the blocking of the internet or blocking of access to specific platforms during elections and during protests, which is also quite a worrying trend in Africa, and something that we need to advocate strongly against. And another issue would be arrests based on online communication. I know when we speak about internet access and affordability, sometimes we do not think also about issues relating to the legal implications or the legal consequences that are stemming from use of the internet, because these also are contributing to restricted or limited use or limited access by members of the citizenry. Obviously, because when there are arrests based on online communication, there's self-censorship that is entrenched. And of course, people don't feel free to access and to use the internet and social media platforms. And I think examples can be taken from Malawi. One journalist was arrested. This is in the period of 2021. A journalist was arrested. A journalist from a community radio was arrested for posting something on his Facebook post that related to misuse of COVID-19 funds. Another lady, Irene Chisulo, was arrested for publishing a voice note on WhatsApp where she was highlighting that some person who was arrested on rape charges, he had been released under questionable circumstances. Then she was arrested also. Apparently, it was publishing false information. In Rwanda, some YouTube bloggers and commentators were arrested for using their platforms to discuss issues that were deemed politically sensitive and critical of the government. We saw that also in Zimbabwe. Journalist Hopo Chingono and some members of the opposition were arrested also based on their online communication on Twitter and Facebook. So we are seeing a trend of social media monitoring by the government and subsequently also arrests based on online communication. That is also creating self-censorship and obviously affecting people's access and use of the internet. But we have seen also some best practices in the region, some key developments which I think are worth taking note of. Firstly, that we have seen mobile network operators, providing platforms, e-learning platforms at zero-rated rates, zero-rated learning portals. For instance, in South Africa, Vodacom and MTN were doing that. So that's also quite progressive. And I think it would be critical to get the uptake of such initiatives by all mobile network operators in our different countries. And we also saw the South Africa's Competition Commission doing a 2-year investigation into the high cost of mobile data. So it's only now that following the conclusion of that investigation, Vodacom and MTN cut off their data tariffs by about 20 to 50%. So it would also be important for competition commissions and regulatory authorities in the other countries to learn from this and to also look into monopolies in the telecommunications industry so as to promote better access to mobile data or lower costs of mobile data. And of course, for CSOs, I think some of the best practices include online campaigns that have been done around the high cost of mobile data. For instance, in South Africa, in Zimbabwe, and in Malawi, there was the hashtag data must fall, which is also quite critical in raising awareness on the need to promote internet access. And we also saw the regulators providing additional spectrum to the mobile network operators and the ISPs. We have examples from Zimbabwe, Kenya, and South Africa, which is also quite a best practice, particularly because we are still in the COVID-19 pandemic era, and there is a need to have access to information and also access to e-learning platforms and access to media. And then, of course, another issue, which I think is a best practice, relates to the acknowledgement by mobile network operators that the internet shutdowns were resulting from government directives. An example would be what was done in Eswatini during their protests, that MTN, as one of the MNOs, had to acknowledge that indeed there's been an internet shutdown and it's coming from a directive from the government. Such levels of accountability would also be very critical from the mobile network operators around the countries, because that would also contribute to developing international standards and best practices for internet governance. And also what would be important is regional support through coalitions and networks. We have seen this during this entire time when there were internet shutdowns in the region. The hashtag Keep It On coalition, was mobilizing different people and different networks to contribute and to amplify their voices against the internet shutdowns, which I think is also a best practice that promotes internet access and affordability. And I hope I'm still within my time. In terms of the recommendations, I have a few here, and I'd be happy to engage and look at more recommendations on what we can do as a region. But I think one of the critical issues is to ensure that we advocate for the buy-in of the private sector, to also start lobbying and advocating for internet access and affordability. This also includes ensuring that they understand the need to balance between business and human rights, because we've seen that most of the arguments around data prices and data cost has been more focused on revenue collection, more focused on the business and profit side of it, without necessarily taking a balanced approach to appreciate that these telecommunication players are also contributing to exercise of human rights. And then there's a need also to undertake digital rights literacy campaigns, particularly targeting ordinary internet users, because it's important for every internet user to appreciate that internet access is a digital right, it's a human right, because when they appreciate that, they'll be able also to advocate and lobby on their own, and to also promote transparency by the government and accountability towards internet access and affordability. And of course, issues of advocating for conducive and reasonable licensing requirements, because we've also seen that there are so many monopolies in the telecommunications industries around the different countries in the region. So it's important also to advocate for conducive licensing requirements so that tech startups can also take in the space, can also contribute to the space. Such competition will also then promote more affordable internet for the broader internet users or the consumers. And then, of course, a multi-stakeholder approach. We cannot underestimate the importance of collaboration between African governments, between the corporate sector, SADC, the AU, and development partners to prioritize also investment in ICT infrastructure. Of note is the need to ensure that countries like Zimbabwe and Malawi appropriately utilize universal services funds. Also, for the other countries that are in the region that have such funds, it's important to ensure that these funds are utilized for the purposes that they were established, For countries like Malawi, the fund is there on paper, but it's yet to be spearheaded and yet to be utilized. So that we need also to ensure that such policies are there that provide for this fund for universal access to the internet, but also that the funds are disbursed appropriately and as intended in terms of the acts that provide for them. To promote digital inclusion, we have seen that it's important also to utilize WhatsApp group conversations. Rural communities are more comfortable engaging or accessing information through WhatsApp groups and WhatsApp group discussions as compared to some of the platforms that would use like Zoom or more recently the Twitter Spaces. So that's something also that I think as CSOs we should consider, especially when targeting rural communities. But of course also that for persons living with disabilities, it's important to advocate for governments to set aside specific budgets and funds for the purchasing of devices that are suitable for people with disabilities with assistive technology that would be useful to them, but also that even when it is resold in the different countries, they also sell at subsidized rates to ensure that people with disabilities can also access the internet and can also benefit from all the critical aspects that the internet provides for that I already mentioned around education, but also the social and economic aspects of it. I think I'll end here for now, Koliwe. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for that, Nompilo. That was really great. I think what I appreciated is also the best practices that you shared with us. But I think I'm just going to check on the chat to see if there are any questions. Please feel free to either throw your questions in the chat or to raise your hand should you have any interventions. We're going to go into 5 minutes for questions for Nompilo, who spoke about the trends, which are, I think, to be fair, Nompilo, we don't seem to have moved much in terms of what the monitoring of the AFDEC coalition was in 2020. I take note of some of the best practices that you've shared with us in terms of zero-rated services, but I think what is clear also in the presentation is that the discounted rates or the zero-rated services were only targeted at learners. So one of my questions for you firstly would be, do you think that after 2 years,